Alright, so last section we dealt with 4 different types of angles. We dealt with corresponding angles. We dealt with alternate interior angles. We dealt with alternate exterior angles. And we dealt with consecutive interior angles. Today we're going to learn something more about each of those dealing with parallel lines. Again, parallel lines are 2 lines that never intersect. A transversal is a line that intersects 2 lines. So here we have parallel lines and a transversal cutting them. You're going to get very used to this idea. We're given a postulate here, and again, I don't care if you remember postulate 15, but this deals with corresponding angles. If 2 parallel lines, like P and Q, are cut by a transversal, like T, then the pairs of corresponding angles are congruent. Pairs of corresponding angles are congruent. Right below that, I want you to write this. Corresponding angles are congruent. At this point, I expect you to be able to identify corresponding angles. I'm not going to I'm not going to walk you through identifying what corresponding angles are. You need to be able to identify them. And remember, they form the F. Now we're learning that if you have 2 parallel lines cut by a transversal, then every pair of corresponding angle is congruent or are congruent. In this case, we have angle 2 and angle 6. And just so you can see it, angle 2 and angle 6 are corresponding angles. They form an upside down F. Corresponding angles are congruent. Angle 2 and angle 6 are the exact same degree. They are congruent. Example 1, we're given an angle is 120 degrees. This angle right here. We're also told that 3 other angles are equal to 120 degrees, meaning 3 other angles are congruent with this angle. We want to find them and explain why they're congruent. So, the first thing we want to do is we're dealing with corresponding angles. So more than likely, I want to try and find a corresponding angle to this angle right here. So, is there an F that deals with that angle? And yes, there is. I can see that angle 3 and angle 120, or 120 degrees, are corresponding angles. I just learned that if I have 2 parallel lines, see those 2 arrows, that tells us that those 2 lines are parallel, cut by a transversal, there's my transversal, we'll label it T, then corresponding angles are congruent. Here I have 120 and 3. These 2 angles are corresponding. According to this postulate, corresponding angles are congruent, which means that 3 and 120 are congruent, or that angle 3 equals 120 degrees. Why? Because they're corresponding angles. And corresponding angles are congruent when you have 2 parallel lines cut by a transversal. Now, we're told that there are 3 angles congruent. We just identified 1. Let's try and find another one. That is the only F I can draw using 120. That's the bottom of my F. There's the other part of my F. I can't draw an F like this because I don't have another line up here. But there is something else that you learned in Chapter 2. And it deals with this here. If this angle is 120, what do you know about angle 6? They're congruent. But why? They are congruent because they are vertical angles. And vertical angles are congruent. Now you might be saying, well, that's not corresponding or alternate or exterior or consecutive. No. But remember this. Everything you learned everything you've learned, you will have to refer to solve new problems. Everything that we've gone over so far, and everything that we are going over, you will have to use to solve newer problems. You have to go back into your memory bank and remember what vertical angles are. Vertical angles are two angles whose sides form opposite rays. Or if you can just remember that they're opposite angles, and opposite angles are congruent. So we're told that angle 6 and 120 are congruent because they're vertical angles, which means that angle 6 is also 120 degrees. There's 2 out of my 3. There's one more. Now, I'm not going to use the 120 anymore. Now I'm going to use angle 6 to try and find a corresponding angle. If I draw my F off of angle 6, I can identify that angle 6 and angle 8 are corresponding angles. Well, I just learned that corresponding angles given two parallel lines cut by a transversal are congruent. Angle 6 and angle 8 are corresponding angles, which means if I apply this postulate right up here, that angle 6 is congruent to angle 8, which if angle 6 is 120, then angle 8 has to be 120 degrees also. There are my 3 angles, 3, 6, and 8. Now there's one more thing I want you to notice before we move on. We just learned that angle 3 is 120, angle 6 is 120, and angle 8 was 120. Whoops, not 180. We learned this, or we learned angle 6 was 120 because of this. We also learned that angle 3 was 120 because of corresponding angles. Now I want you to look at this. What do you notice about angle 3 and angle 8? They are also vertical angles. Geometry continues to prove itself over and over again. You may not have had to use corresponding angles. The fact that you knew angle 3 was 120, we could have used vertical angles to find out what angle 8 was. We didn't need corresponding. Be able to take what you've already learned, everything you've already learned, and apply it to new problems. So there we're dealing with corresponding angles being congruent. Flip the page and you'll notice we have 3 more things. These are theorems, not postulates, but they mean the same thing. Here we have alternate interior angles. Here we have alternate exterior angles. Here we have consecutive interior angles. See how we're revisiting all 4 of them over again. Here's my Z. Here's my alternate exterior. Here's my consecutive interior. Remember, your corresponding angles form an F. Your alternate interior form a Z. Alternate exterior are the goofy ones. Consecutive interior form a C, whether it's backwards or forwards. You should be able to identify these now, because now we're learning new things about them. We're learning, in this case, that if you have 2 parallel lines cut by a transversal, just like with corresponding angles, by the way, 2 parallel lines cut by a transversal, alternate interior angles are congruent. The same thing about alternate exterior. If you have 2 parallel lines cut by a transversal, Alternate exterior angles are congruent. There's one more thing, and I know this is going to throw a lot of you. This one's going to throw you, so make sure you pay attention. Two parallel lines cut by a transversal, consecutive interior angles are supplementary. Supplementary. Not congruent, but supplementary. Remember this, supplementary means two angles that equal 180. I know that's going to throw a lot of you. We back up, corresponding angles are congruent. Alternate interior angles are congruent. Alternate exterior angles are congruent. But consecutive interior angles are supplementary. 3 are congruent, 1 is supplementary. Make sure that you're able to differentiate which one is which. Notice one thing we have all in common. All of these are dealt with parallel lines. If you don't have parallel lines and you can't prove they're parallel lines, then none of this falls into play. The first thing you have to have, let's go through and read some of these actually. If two parallel lines are cut by a transversal. If two parallel lines are cut by a transversal. If two parallel lines are cut by a transversal. If we go back to corresponding, if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal. The first thing you have to have are parallel lines cut by a transversal. If you don't have that, you don't have corresponding angles being congruent, or alternate interior angles being congruent, or alternate exterior angles being congruent, or consecutive interior angles being supplementary. Make sure that you remember consecutive interior angles are supplementary. Those 4 new ideas, 3 of them being congruent, 1 of them being supplementary, that is used the rest of the time in geometry. The rest of the year, you're going to be referring back to these. Very, very important. Example 2, we're told to find the value of x, which is right here. Let's look at what they give me right away. They give me right away, in this diagram of example 2, that this angle up here is 115 degrees. Do I know anything else? Reaching back into my memory bank, is there anything else that is similar to this angle? Hopefully you're saying in your head, yeah, angle W is a vertical angle. And vertical angles are congruent, which means that W is 115 also, because they're congruent. Why are they congruent? Because they're vertical angles. Vertical angles are congruent. Well, now I know angle W. I don't care about 115 anymore, because I can't identify corresponding angles. I can't identify alternate interior angles, because I don't have a Z anywhere with the 115. I can't identify consecutive interior angles, and I can't identify alternate exterior angles. So the 115 is pretty much not helping me with my X. But if I look at the W does give me some information. If I highlight that, if I try and identify corresponding angles, well, there is no angle down here. My X is right here. I'm trying to figure out what angles I can use to identify X. It's not an F, it's not a Z, because again, the X isn't right here. Let's see if consecutive interior works. This idea of consecutive interior angles is going to help me solve letter X, because letter X and letter W are consecutive interior angles. Well, what do you know about consecutive interior angles? They are what? I hope you're not saying congruent. I hope you are saying they are supplementary. If these two angles are supplementary, that means what? They add up to 180 degrees. Well, that's easy. W plus x plus 5 equals 180. That's the definition of supplementary angles. This angle plus this angle equals 180 degrees. Well, now I'm going to rewrite this because I know that W also equals 115. So I'm going to cross him off, and in his place I'm going to write 115 plus x plus 5 equals 180. The same statement, but I used the substitution property, by the way, substitution property, to substitute in what W equals. Well, now I'm going to simplify this. I know that 115 plus 5 is actually 120. So now I have 120 plus x equals 180. Well, you know how to solve this. We subtract 120 from both sides. So 120 minus 120, or 180 minus 120, I get x equals 60. Let's look again at what we did. The first thing we did here, we used vertical angles to establish that if this angle is 115, then this angle is 115. Then we used consecutive interior angles to establish that if W is 115, then x plus 5 and W have to be supplementary angles. So we set up an equation. W plus x plus 5 equals 180. That's the definition of supplementary angles. They have to add up and equal 180. Then we used substitution to say, I don't care what W is, I know that W equals 115. So I'm going to substitute 115 in for W to help me solve for x. I don't want to solve x when I have two variables here, so I'm going to cut out my W variable and leave just my x. Then I'm going to solve, and actually solve for x using my algebra. Vertical angles, consecutive interior angles, substitution, then we can solve. Notice that that's a long process to finally get to solving our problem. You have to be able to resort to using corresponding angles, using alternate interior angles, using alternate exterior angles, using consecutive interior angles being supplementary. You have to be able to use all of those in order to solve some of these problems, like you're going to see in a second. That is so much harder if you can't even identify them. We spent a lot of time in 3.1 just identifying the different angles. Because now that you can identify them, we're telling you they're congruent, or they're supplementary. Well, if you still can't even identify them, then you're not even going to be able to solve them, let alone be able to figure out where they're at. You have to be able to identify them. Before we go any farther, we've got a couple problems here. We have A and B. I want you to solve one of them. You're going to pause the video and solve letter A or B. Now, before you hit pause, I want you to look at them together. If the measure of angle 5 is 105 degrees, 105 degrees, find the measure of all the other angles. That's pretty tough. Then we're told in letter B that if angle 3 is 68 degrees and angle 8 is 2x plus 4 degrees, they want us to find the value of x. Well, you're going to use all of your geometry knowledge in letter A to solve for the other missing angles. By the way, you can't say in letter A that number 3 or angle 3 is 68 degrees. That only applies to letter B. But you're going to have to use all your knowledge of geometry in letter A to solve for the other 7 missing angles. In letter B, you're also going to have to use a lot of your knowledge to be able to say, okay, angle 3 is 68, angle 8 is 2x plus 4. How are they connected? And you're going to have to use some information there. I want you to pause the video and solve one of those two right now. I don't care which, because if you can solve either of them, that shows a very extensive knowledge of some of the stuff that we've gone over. And if you can't solve them, don't get frustrated. This is practice. It's not like you're getting graded on this. All I want you to do is try. Take your time, solve one or the other, and when you're ready, go ahead and hit play. Okay, if you solved letter A, I want you to look at this, because I didn't solve it for you, but I did show you some of the steps. Angle 5, let me erase some of this so that you can see, and again, this is if you solved letter A. If you solved letter B, then just wait a few more seconds, and I'll get to you. They told me that angle 5 is 105 degrees. I know that angle 5 and angle 8 are vertical angles, so angle 5 and angle 8 are congruent. If angle 5 and angle 8 are congruent, then angle 8 is 105 degrees also. I know that angle 5 and angle 4 are alternate interior angles. I just got done learning that alternate interior angles, see how they form a Z, by the way? Alternate interior angles are congruent. And if 4 and 5 are congruent, then angle 4 is also 105 degrees. I know that if angle 5 is 105 degrees, then angle 1 and angle 5 are congruent because they are corresponding angles. And because angle 1 and angle 5 are congruent because they're corresponding angles, if angle 5 is 105 degrees, then angle 1 is 105 degrees. Then I started using some of my other ones. And I learn, or then I can see that angle 5 plus angle 2 are consecutive interior angles, which means that angle 5 plus angle 2 have to be supplementary or add up to 180. Again, because that's the consecutive interior angle theorem that we just learned. Consecutive interior angles of parallel lines cut by a transversal are supplementary. So I can set 5 plus 2 equal to 180. Then I would solve for angle 2 and find out that angle 2 equals 75 degrees. I would do the same thing for angle 6 and angle 7. You might say, why? Because they're not consecutive interior angles. No, you're right, but watch. Angle 5 and angle 7 form a what? They form a straight line. And the angle addition postulate tells me that if angle 5 plus angle 7 form a straight line, then angle 5 and angle 7 are supplementary, or they form a straight angle. And so I would use the exact same thing, the exact same algebra, to solve for angle 7, and if I erase this so you can see it, I can do the same thing with angle 5 and angle 6. They form a straight line. I can use the angle addition postulate to solve for angle 6. When I do that, I find out that angle 7 is 75 degrees and angle 6 is 75 degrees. The only angle I haven't solved yet is angle 3, but I did solve angle 2. And what do you notice about angle 2 and angle 3? They are vertical angles. Vertical angles are congruent, so if angle 2 is 75, angle 3 is 75. There are the steps that I use to solve for those 7 missing angles. Now, you may have said, well, I used a different way. Be able to back up how you did it and make sure that it's mathematically correct. Here, I told you what I did to solve it, and I backed it up. I used vertical angles, alternate interior angles, corresponding angles, consecutive interior angles, the angle addition postulate, and I used vertical angles again. You better be able to explain to me why or how you use those. Now let's go to letter B. If you solved letter B, these are the steps that you could have used. I'm not saying these are the exact steps, but these are the steps that you could have used. There are different ways to solve letter B, but you should still get the same answer. The first thing that I did was I said angle 3 and angle 2 are congruent. Why are they congruent? Because they are vertical angles. See how I wrote vertical angles here? If angle 3 is 68 and angle 2 are congruent, then angle 2 is also 68 degrees. Then I said that angle 2 and angle 6 are congruent. The reason I can say that is because angle 2 and angle 6 are corresponding angles. Corresponding angles are congruent. So if angle 2 is 68, angle 6 has to be 68. Then I used the straight angle theorem, or the definition of a straight angle, or you could call it the angle addition postulate, however you want to say it. And I said that, I said that angle 6 plus angle 8 gives me a straight line, or that angle 6 plus angle 8 equals 180 degrees. Then I can substitute and say that not only do angle 6 plus angle 8 equal 180, what they equals 180. So instead of writing angle 6 plus angle 8 equals 180 degrees, I'm going to substitute in what 6 and 8 equal. Angle 6 is 68 degrees, plus angle 8, which is 2x plus 4 degrees, and all of that equals 180. Now I can use algebra to solve this. And when I do that, I get 2x plus 72 equals 180, 2x equals 108, x equals 59, and I'm done. What did I do? I used vertical angles to find angle 2, corresponding angles to find angle 6. Then I used the angle addition postulate, or the straight angle, the definition of a straight angle, to say that 6 plus 8 equals 180. I used substitution to establish an equation, and then I solved it using my algebra. Now you could have done the exact same thing with angle 7. You could have said angle 3 and angle 7 are congruent because they are corresponding angles. Angle 7 plus angle 8 form a straight line, so angle 7 plus angle 8 equal 180. And you could have used the exact same thing, 68 plus 2x plus 4 equals 180, to solve for x. Either way that you did it, using angle 6 or angle 7, you should still find that x equals 59. So now that you solved those two problems, A and B, or you solved one of them, let's go ahead and take a look at your homework now.